I never thought a couple of propane tanks would nearly land me in legal hell, but that's exactly what happened when Karen Whitmore decided to make my life her personal mission. It started on a Tuesday morning in November when I was checking my mail outside my house in Scottsdale, Arizona. The sun was already beating down despite it being barely 8 in the morning, and I was looking forward to getting back inside to my air-conditioned office where I could focus on my freelance graphic design work. Instead, I found myself face-to-face with Karen, the president of our Saguaro Springs HOA, marching across the street toward me with a clipboard clutched to her chest like it was some kind of holy scripture. "Xavier Thompson," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to talk about your flagrant violation of community standards." I turned around, confused. My yard was immaculate. I just had the desert landscaping redone 2 months ago, all native plants and proper rock coverage. My house was painted the exact shade of beige that the HOA had approved. I even kept my trash cans in the garage except on collection days. "What violation?" I asked, genuinely bewildered. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger toward the side of my house. "Those propane tanks. They're an eyesore and a safety hazard. They need to be removed immediately." I followed her gaze to the 2 standard 100-pound propane tanks sitting on a concrete pad beside my house. They were positioned exactly where the builder had installed them when the house was constructed 5 years ago, long before I'd bought the place. These tanks supplied my backup generator, my outdoor grill built into the patio kitchen, and my pool heater. They were painted a neutral tan color to blend with the house, partially screened by decorative brickwork, and completely up to code. "Karen, those tanks have been there since the house was built. They're code compliant and they're necessary for my generator system." Her face reddened, clashing with her highlighted blonde bob. "I don't care when they were installed. The HOA board had a meeting last week, and we've decided that all exterior propane storage is prohibited. You have 30 days to remove them, or you'll face daily fines of $50. "That's insane," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "Half the houses in this neighborhood have propane tanks. What about the Mitchells 3 houses down? Or the Rodriguezes on the corner? We're addressing all violations systematically," she said primly. "You happen to be first on the list. You'll receive an official notice in the mail within 3 business days. Good day, Mr. Thompson." She spun on her heel and marched back toward her own house, leaving me standing there in the morning heat with a growing sense of dread in my stomach. True to her word, the official notice arrived exactly 3 days later. It was printed on expensive cardstock with the HOA logo at the top, citing some obscure clause about maintaining aesthetic uniformity and potential safety hazards. The letter demanded removal of the propane tanks within 30 days and threatened escalating fines if I didn't comply. I immediately called my real estate attorney, Marcus Chen, who I'd used when I bought the house. He listened to my explanation and asked me to email him the notice along with my original HOA documents. "Give me a day to review everything," he said. But off the top of my head, if those tanks were installed by the builder and were there when you bought the property, the HOA can't suddenly declare them a violation. That's called selective enforcement, and it's not legal. The next afternoon, Marcus called me back with news that was both good and bad. "The good news is that you're absolutely in the right here," he said. The builder installed those tanks as part of the original construction, and they were clearly visible during the HOA approval process for that model home. There's no way they can claim this is a new violation. The bad news is that fighting this is going to be expensive and time-consuming. "How expensive?" Legal fees could run you $5,000 to $10,000 if it goes to court, maybe more if they really dig in. And HOAs can be vindictive. They might start scrutinizing every single thing about your property, looking for other violations to cite. I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. I ran my own business from home, which meant my income was decent but not unlimited. Dropping 10 grand on legal fees would hurt, especially with the holidays coming up. But the principle of the thing made my blood boil. I hadn't done anything wrong. That weekend, I attended the monthly HOA meeting held in the Clubhouse, a sprawling facility at the center of our development that included a gym, pool, meeting rooms, and a full kitchen for community events. About 40 residents showed up, which was actually a good turnout for our community of 200 homes. Karen sat at the head table with the other board members. Dennis Patterson, the vice president who always seemed half asleep. Gloria Martinez, the treasurer who actually seemed reasonable. And Todd Brennan, the secretary who functioned primarily as Karen's yes man. When the meeting opened for new business, I raised my hand. "Yes, Xavier," Karen said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I want to discuss this new policy about propane tanks." I received a violation notice, but these tanks were installed by the builder and have been there since before I bought the house. How can the HOA suddenly declare them a violation? A few other homeowners murmured in agreement. I noticed Frank Mitchell, whose tanks I'd mentioned to Karen, nodding vigorously from the back row. "The board has determined that exposed propane tanks are unsightly and potentially dangerous," Karen said smoothly. "We have the authority to update and enforce community standards as we see fit." "But you're selectively enforcing this," I argued. "Other houses have the same tanks. Are you going after everyone or just me?" Her smile tightened. "As I told you before, we're addressing violations systematically." "Now, if there's no other business, actually, I have a question," Frank called out. "I've got the same setup as Xavier. When am I getting my notice?" "Yeah, and what about the people with those big green propane tanks in their yards?" someone else added. "Those are way more visible than Xavier's." Karen's face was turning an interesting shade of purple. "The board will address all violations in due course. This meeting is not a forum for you to question the board's authority." "Actually, according to our bylaws, that's exactly what these meetings are for," Gloria interjected quietly. "Maybe we should table the propane tank policy and discuss it further. I'm not sure we properly considered the implications." "The decision has been made," Karen snapped, shooting Gloria a look that could have melted steel. "Moving on." After the meeting, several neighbors approached me to express their support. Frank even offered to split legal costs if we wanted to fight the HOA together. But what really caught my attention was something Gloria mentioned as she was leaving. "You might want to check the building permits for the clubhouse renovations they did last year," she said quietly. I raised some concerns about the heating system upgrade during budget discussions, but I was outvoted. Just a thought. I went home and did some digging. Our HOA operated under Arizona state law, which meant that major capital improvements required not only board approval, but also notification to homeowners if they exceeded a certain threshold. The clubhouse renovation had cost close to $200,000 according to the meeting minutes I found in my email archives, but I couldn't recall ever seeing detailed breakdowns of the work. More importantly, I started researching the clubhouse's heating system. Our community was in the desert, but winter nights could get cold, and the clubhouse was used year-round for events. I pulled up the building department records for Maricopa County online and found the permit applications for the clubhouse renovation. That's when things got interesting. The original heating system for the clubhouse had been electric baseboard heaters, adequate for the mild winters but expensive to run. Last year's renovation had included upgrading to a more efficient forced air system. But here's what caught my eye. The new system was powered by propane. Specifically, it relied on large propane tanks that were installed behind the clubhouse, hidden behind decorative screening. I couldn't help but laugh at the irony. The HOA was threatening to fine me for having propane tanks that were part of my home's original construction, while they just spent thousands of dollars installing their own propane system. Over the next week, I got my ducks in a row. I contacted Marcus again and explained what I'd found. He loved it. "This is perfect," he said. "It's clear selective enforcement and massive hypocrisy. We can definitely fight this." But I had a different idea brewing. See, I'd done some more research into exactly how the clubhouse propane system worked. The building permits showed that they'd installed two 500-gallon propane tanks behind the clubhouse. Those tanks supplied not just the heating system, but also the water heaters for the showers in the gym area and the large commercial range in the kitchen. I pulled out my original deed and title documents and started reading through every single page of the HOA agreements I'd signed at closing. Most of it was standard boilerplate about maintaining property values and following community rules. But buried deep in the appendices was something fascinating: an easement agreement. When the development was first built, the original developer had needed to install utilities throughout the property. My lot, because of its position near the street and its proximity to the main gas line, had been granted an easement for a propane storage facility that would serve as a backup supply point. The builder had installed my 2 tanks as part of that agreement. But here's the kicker. When the HOA took over from the developer, they'd apparently decided that maintaining a separate propane distribution system was too expensive. Instead, they'd arranged for individual homes to have their own tanks if needed. However, when they did the clubhouse renovation and needed a large propane supply, they'd connected their new tanks to the same supply line that ran past my property. My tanks weren't just for my house. They were also serving as a backup and pressure regulation point for the clubhouse system. I called Marcus again and explained what I'd found. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Are you telling me that your propane tanks are actually part of the infrastructure for the HOA's clubhouse?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. The supply line runs from the main connection on the street, through the easement on my property where my tanks are located, and then continues on to the clubhouse. My tanks serve as a backup and help regulate pressure for the whole system. Can you prove this?" "I can have a licensed propane technician trace the lines and provide documentation. It'll cost me a few $100, but it'll be worth it." "Do it," Marcus said immediately. "This changes everything." I hired a company called Desert Propane Services, and their head technician, a guy named Ray who'd been working with propane systems for 30 years, came out the next day. I explained the situation, showed him the building permits and easement documents, and asked him to trace the propane lines. It took him about 3 hours, but when he was done, Ray had a detailed report with photos and diagrams. "You were right," he said, showing me his findings. "The main supply line comes in from the street here, connects to your tanks for backup storage and pressure regulation, then continues on that line there toward the clubhouse. Your tanks are definitely part of the system. If you remove them, the clubhouse will lose its backup supply and could have pressure regulation issues." "Could have issues, or definitely will have issues." Ray scratched his chin. "Depends on demand. On a cool day when they're not running the heat hard, they'd probably be fine. But on a cold night when the heat's running full blast and someone's using the kitchen and hot water, they'd definitely have problems. The system was designed with your tanks as part of the pressure regulation. Without them, they'd likely experience flow issues and the heating system would shut down automatically as a safety measure. What if the propane company just disconnected my tanks from the line? Then you'd have no propane for your house, and the clubhouse would have the same problems I just described. The whole system is integrated. I paid Ray for his time and asked him to prepare a formal written report with his professional opinion. He promised to have it to me within 2 business days. Meanwhile, the 30-day deadline Karen had given me was approaching fast. I received a reminder notice in the mail, this one even more threatening in tone, warning me that fines would begin accruing if I didn't comply immediately. I decided it was time to play my hand. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the first Thursday in December. I made sure to arrive early, and I brought Marcus with me as my legal counsel. Karen's eyes narrowed when she saw him, but she couldn't prevent an attorney from attending an open meeting. When we got to new business, I raised my hand again. "Yes, Xavier," Karen said with exaggerated patience. "I wanted to provide an update on the propane tank situation," I said pleasantly. "I've hired a licensed propane technician to evaluate my system, and I've discovered something interesting that I think the board should be aware of." I handed out copies of Ray's report to the board members and several other homeowners who were sitting nearby. "As you can see from this professional assessment," I continued, "my propane tanks aren't just serving my house. They're actually part of the pressure regulation and backup system for the clubhouse's propane supply. The system was designed this way by the original developer, and it's documented in the easement agreements that are part of my property deed." Karen snatched up the report and started scanning it, her face going pale. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered. "The clubhouse has its own propane tanks." "It does," I agreed. "But according to this report from a licensed professional, the system was designed with my tanks as an integral part of the pressure regulation. If I remove my tanks as you've demanded, the clubhouse could experience heating system failures, especially during peak usage." Gloria was reading the report carefully, her expression thoughtful. Dennis looked confused as usual. Todd was staring at Karen, waiting for her to tell him what to think. "This is clearly a stalling tactic," Karen said, her voice rising. "You're just trying to avoid complying with a legitimate HOA directive." "Actually," Marcus spoke up for the first time, "my client is trying to avoid destroying property that the HOA itself depends on. If Mr. Thompson removes his propane tanks as you've demanded, and the clubhouse heating system subsequently fails, the HOA could be liable for the costs of installing a new system." "That's absurd," Karen snapped. "Is it?" Marcus pulled out another document. "I've reviewed the building permits for the clubhouse renovation. The design specifically accounts for backup propane supply and pressure regulation from the tanks on Mr. Thompson's property. If the board forces him to remove essential infrastructure, you'll be liable for any resulting damages or necessary repairs." The room had gone very quiet. Several homeowners were whispering to each other, and I could see Gloria doing mental calculations, probably estimating how much a heating system failure and emergency repair would cost. "I propose we table the propane tank policy until we can have an engineer review the entire system," Gloria said firmly. "If Xavier's tanks are actually part of the clubhouse infrastructure, we need to know that before we make any decisions." "I second that motion," Frank called out from the back. Karen looked like she wanted to argue, but even Todd seemed to realize that pushing forward would be a bad idea. "Fine," Karen said through gritted teeth. "We'll table the discussion pending further review. But Mr. Thompson, if this turns out to be some kind of fabrication, you'll be facing serious consequences." "The report is from a licensed professional," I said calmly. "Everything in it is verifiable. I'm happy to have a second technician review the system if the board wants an independent assessment." The meeting moved on to other business, but I could feel Karen's eyes boring into me the entire time. As people filed out afterward, several neighbors stopped to shake my hand or pat me on the back. Frank was grinning ear to ear. "Man, you really threw a wrench in her plans," he said. "I can't believe your tanks are actually hooked up to the clubhouse. That's beautiful." Marcus and I walked to our cars together. "That went well," he said. "But I don't think Karen's going to let this drop. She strikes me as the vindictive type." He was right. 2 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a firm called Mitchell, Stevens & Howe. The letter demanded that I provide access to my property for an independent inspection of the propane system by an engineer of their choosing. It also accused me of interfering with HOA operations and presenting false information to the board. I forwarded the letter to Marcus, who laughed when he read it. "They're panicking," he said. "Let them do their inspection. It'll just confirm what Ray already told us." I responded through Marcus, agreeing to the inspection, but demanding that it be done by a licensed propane systems engineer, not just some general contractor Karen knew. We set a date for the following week. The engineer the HOA hired was a serious woman named Dr. Patricia Ellsworth, who had a doctorate in mechanical engineering and specialized in commercial propane systems. She spent 4 hours examining the setup, tracing lines, checking connections, and reviewing documentation. I made sure to be present for the entire inspection, taking my own photos and notes. When she was finished, Dr. Ellsworth sat down with me at my kitchen table to go over her findings. "Mr. Thompson, your technician's report was accurate," she said. "Your tanks are definitely integrated into the clubhouse supply system. They provide backup storage capacity and help regulate pressure throughout the distribution network. Removing them would compromise the clubhouse system's reliability. So if the HOA forces me to remove them, what would happen? In cold weather with high demand, you'd likely see pressure drops that would cause the clubhouse heating system to shut down automatically. The safety cutoffs would kick in to prevent damage to the equipment. They'd need to install additional storage capacity and pressure regulation equipment at the clubhouse to compensate for the loss of your tanks. I'd estimate that would cost somewhere between $15,000 and $25,000. I thanked her for her time, and she promised to send her full report to both me and the HOA within a few days. That weekend, I was in my garage working on a client's logo design when my phone rang. It was Gloria from the HOA board. "Xavier, I wanted to give you a heads up," she said quietly. "Karen is furious about the engineer's report. She's talking about forcing you to remove the tanks anyway and making you pay for the upgrades to the clubhouse system." "She can't do that," I said. "I didn't create this situation. The developer designed it this way." "I know, and I've tried to explain that to her. But she's convinced you're somehow trying to undermine her authority. There's an emergency board meeting tonight at 7. You might want to attend." I thanked Gloria for the warning and called Marcus immediately. He couldn't make the meeting because he had a family obligation, but he gave me clear instructions. "Don't let them bully you into anything," he said. "If they try to pass any resolutions about your property, object on the record. I'll follow up with a formal letter if needed." The emergency meeting was held in one of the smaller rooms at the clubhouse, and only about 15 homeowners showed up. Karen called the meeting to order and immediately launched into a prepared statement. "As everyone knows, We've been dealing with Xavier Thompson's refusal to comply with HOA standards regarding his propane tanks. We've now had 2 professional assessments confirming that his tanks are connected to the Clubhouse system. However, this does not give Mr. Thompson the right to ignore our community standards. She paused dramatically, looking around the room. Therefore, the board is proposing the following resolution. Xavier Thompson will be required to disconnect and remove his propane tanks within 60 days. In exchange, the HOA will cover the cost of upgrading the Clubhouse propane system to function independently. However, Mr. Thompson will be assessed a special fee of $20,000 to cover these upgrades, since his non-compliance is necessitating this expense. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Point of order," I called out. "This is insane. You're trying to fine me $20,000 for having propane tanks that were installed by the developer as part of the original construction. Tanks that your own clubhouse depends on. You're interfering with the board's ability to enforce community standards," Karen shot back. "If you had simply complied with the original notice, none of this would be necessary." "I object to this resolution on the record," I said firmly. "This is selective enforcement, retaliation, and a completely unreasonable assessment. My attorney will be filing a formal objection, and if you try to enforce this, I'll see you in court." "Your objection is noted," Karen said coldly. "All in favor of the resolution." She and Todd immediately raised their hands. Dennis looked uncomfortable, but slowly raised his hand as well. Gloria kept her hand firmly on the table. "The motion passes 3-1, Karen announced with a triumphant smile. "You'll receive official documentation within 5 business days, Mr. Thompson." I walked out of that meeting knowing that this was about to get a whole lot worse before it got better. Marcus was predictably furious when I called him that night to explain what had happened. A $20,000 special assessment for having tanks that the developer installed and that the HOA relies on. That's not just unreasonable, it's probably actionable as harassment. We're going to fight this, Xavier. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus prepared a comprehensive response that outlined every reason why the HOA's resolution was legally invalid. He cited case law on selective enforcement, unreasonable assessments, and HOA overreach. He also sent a letter directly to the HOA's attorney, Mitchell, Stevens, and Howe, warning them that their clients were exposing themselves to significant legal liability. Meanwhile, I started receiving hate mail. Anonymous notes would appear in my mailbox or tucked under my windshield wipers, calling me a troublemaker and accusing me of costing the community money. Someone spray-painted "HOA terrorist" on my driveway one night, and I had to spend a Saturday morning pressure washing it off. I filed a police report about the vandalism, but the Scottsdale PD officer who took the report wasn't optimistic about catching the culprit. "HOA disputes," he said with a weary sigh. "We see this stuff all the time. People get crazy about their property values and neighborhood drama. Best advice: get security cameras." I took his advice and installed a comprehensive camera system covering all sides of my house and yard. The cameras were expensive, but I figured they'd pay for themselves if they prevented further vandalism or provided evidence of who was harassing me. Christmas came and went in a blur of stress and legal paperwork. I tried to enjoy the holidays, but the HOA situation hung over everything like a dark cloud. I kept waiting for the official documentation of the special assessment, but it never arrived. Marcus explained that the HOA's attorney had probably advised them to hold off while they reviewed our objections. The new year brought a cold snap to Arizona. In early January, Temperatures dropped into the 20s at night, which was unusually cold for Scottsdale. My propane-powered generator kicked on a few times when we had brief power outages, and I noticed that my tanks were getting low. I called to schedule a delivery. That's when I got an interesting piece of information from the propane delivery company. "Mr. Thompson, we show that your tanks are on a commercial delivery schedule because they're part of the Clubhouse supply system," the dispatcher said. "We bill the HOA directly for refills. Are you sure you want to pay for this delivery yourself?" I paused, thinking quickly. "Let me ask you something. If I wanted to disconnect my tanks from the Clubhouse system and just have them service my house, could I do that?" "Sure. You just need a licensed technician to cap off the supply line that runs to the Clubhouse. It's a pretty simple job. We could have someone out there next week. How much would that cost? Maybe $300 or $400. Do you want to schedule that?" I told her I'd think about it and call back. Then I sat down to really consider my options. The HOA wanted my tanks gone. They'd threatened to fine me $20,000 if I didn't remove them. But my tanks were actually providing a service to the HOA by supporting the Clubhouse propane system. What if I just gave them exactly what they wanted? I called Marcus and explained my idea. "If I disconnect my tanks from the Clubhouse supply line, I'm not violating any HOA rules," I said. "I'm just modifying my own property's utility connections. The HOA never specifically required me to keep my tanks connected to their system. They just demanded I remove them entirely." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You know what happens if you disconnect your tanks, right? The Clubhouse loses its backup supply and pressure regulation. According to Dr. Ellsworth's report, yes, they'd have problems in cold weather with high demand. And we're in the middle of a cold snap." "We are," Marcus chuckled. "Xavier, I can't officially advise you to do something that might cause problems for the HOA. But I can tell you that you have every legal right to modify your own utility connections on your own property, as long as it's done by a licensed professional and meets code requirements." That's what I thought. "Thanks, Marcus." I called the propane company back and scheduled a technician to come out and disconnect my tanks from the Clubhouse supply line. The appointment was set for Monday morning, 2 days away. That weekend, the HOA was hosting a big community event at the Clubhouse. It was some kind of combined potluck and game night that Karen had organized, and she'd been promoting it heavily for weeks. The weather forecast called for temperatures in the low 20s Sunday night and Monday morning, the coldest weather Scottsdale had seen in years. I didn't attend the event. Instead, I stayed home and worked on client projects, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. Was I really going to do this? Was I going to disconnect my tanks and potentially sabotage the Clubhouse heating system? But then I reminded myself, I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was simply exercising my legal right to modify my own property's utility connections. The HOA had threatened to fine me into bankruptcy for having those tanks. They'd vandalized my property and harassed me. They'd shown me zero consideration or willingness to compromise. They could deal with the consequences of their own demands. Monday morning arrived bitter cold. I could see my breath in the air as I waited for the propane technician to arrive. His truck pulled up at 8:30, and I met him in my driveway. The technician, whose name was Lewis, reviewed the work order and then examined the tank setup. "So you just want me to cap off the supply line to the Clubhouse and make sure your tanks are only serving your house?" he asked. "Exactly. Can you do it?" "Sure, no problem. It'll take me maybe an hour. You'll need to keep people away from the Clubhouse when I shut off the line, though. Their system will register a pressure drop." "How long will the shutdown take?" "Just a few minutes while I isolate your tanks and cap the line." Then their system will come back online but without your tanks in the loop. I nodded. Do it. Lewis got to work and I went inside to watch from my window. True to his word, he had the job done in just under an hour. When he knocked on my door to get my signature on the work order, he confirmed that my tanks were now completely isolated and serving only my house. The clubhouse is on its own now, he said. They should be fine as long as their usage isn't too high. I thanked him and paid the bill, then settled in to wait. Nothing happened at first. Monday passed quietly, though the temperature stayed brutally cold. Tuesday was more of the same. I started to wonder if maybe the clubhouse would be fine after all, if Dr. Ellsworth's concerns had been overblown. Then Wednesday morning I woke up to my phone ringing at 6:30. It was Frank. "Xavier, are you seeing this?" he said excitedly. "There are maintenance trucks all over the clubhouse. Something's wrong with the heating system. People are saying it failed overnight." I got dressed and drove over to the clubhouse, parking across the street where I could see but wouldn't be in the way. Sure enough, there were 2 trucks from a commercial HVAC company parked outside, and I could see workers in coveralls going in and out of the building. Karen was there too, standing in the parking lot in an expensive down jacket, gesticulating wildly and talking on her phone. Even from a distance, I could see that she was furious. I stayed for about 20 minutes, watching the scene before heading back home. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to be directly associated with it. Around noon, I got a call from Gloria. "Xavier, the clubhouse heating system failed last night," she said. "The HVAC technicians are saying it's a propane pressure issue. Karen is losing her mind." "That's unfortunate," I said carefully. "Did you do something to your tanks?" I chose my words carefully. "I hired a licensed technician to disconnect my tanks from the clubhouse supply line. I have the right to modify my own utility connections on my own property, especially when the HOA has been threatening to fine me for having those tanks in the first place." Gloria was silent for a long moment. "So the clubhouse doesn't have your tanks for backup anymore?" "Correct. And now the heating system is failing because of pressure regulation issues, exactly like Dr. Ellsworth predicted." "It would seem that way." Gloria laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "Karen is going to explode when she figures out what you did." "I didn't do anything wrong, Gloria. I simply disconnected my property from the HOA's system. They wanted my tanks gone anyway." "I know, and honestly, Karen brought this on herself, but you should prepare for fallout. She's not going to take this well." She was right. By Thursday morning, Karen had apparently figured out what had happened. I received an email from her, CC'd to the entire HOA board and the HOA attorney, accusing me of criminal sabotage and willfully damaging HOA property. She demanded that I immediately reconnect my tanks to the clubhouse system and threatened to seek criminal charges if I didn't comply. Marcus responded on my behalf with a beautifully crafted letter explaining that I had every legal right to modify utility connections on my own property, that I had hired a licensed professional to do the work in accordance with all applicable codes, and that the HOA had been demanding I remove those very same tanks for months. He pointed out the hypocrisy of the HOA now demanding that I keep the tanks connected after threatening to fine me for having them. He also noted that if the HOA attempted to file criminal charges, he would immediately file a countersuit for harassment, selective enforcement, and abuse of authority. The HOA attorney's response came 2 days later. It was much more measured in tone than Karen's email, but the message was clear. The HOA expected me to reconnect my tanks, and if I didn't, they would pursue all available legal remedies. Marcus and I had a long conversation about how to respond. "Here's the thing," Marcus said. "They don't really have legal grounds to force you to reconnect your tanks. Those tanks are on your property, and you have the right to control your own utility connections. The only way they could compel you would be if there was an easement agreement that specifically required you to provide propane service to the clubhouse, and no such agreement exists. So, what do? We offer them a deal. You'll consider reconnecting your tanks to their system, but only if they drop all threats of fines and assessments, issue a formal written apology for their harassment, and compensate you for your legal fees to date, which, by the way, are now up to about $8,000. They'll never go for that. Maybe not. But it puts the ball in their court and shows that you're willing to be reasonable. If they refuse and try to pursue legal action, we'll have a clear record of you attempting to compromise while they continue to be unreasonable. We sent the proposal to the HOA attorney, and then we waited. Meanwhile, the clubhouse heating system remained offline. According to Frank, who kept me updated on the neighborhood gossip, the HVAC company had confirmed that the problem was insufficient propane pressure during peak demand. They could install additional storage tanks and pressure regulation equipment at the clubhouse, but it would cost about $18,000 and take at least 2 weeks to complete. The HOA had to cancel several scheduled events because the building was too cold to use comfortably. Karen tried to hold her monthly board meeting there anyway, but residents complained so much about the frigid temperature that they had to relocate to Gloria's house halfway through. I heard through the grapevine that Karen blamed me for everything and was telling anyone who would listen that I was a vindictive troublemaker who had sabotaged community property. But I also heard that plenty of residents were on my side, pointing out that the HOA had brought this situation on themselves by threatening me in the first place. 2 weeks after we sent our proposal, the HOA attorney finally responded. They rejected our terms, claimed that I was obligated to reconnect my tanks under the original easement agreement, and threatened to file a lawsuit if I didn't comply within 15 days. Marcus read the letter and shook his head. They're bluffing. There's no language in the easement agreement that requires you to provide propane service to the HOA. They're just hoping you'll back down. What do you want to do? I thought about it carefully. I could give in, reconnect my tanks, and go back to the status quo. It would be the path of least resistance, and it would probably make my day-to-day life easier. No more angry emails, no more harassment, no more stress. But it would also mean letting the HOA bully me into submission. It would mean accepting that they could threaten me with unreasonable fines and then demand my help when their own decisions came back to bite them. I want to stand firm, I said. If they want to sue me, let them sue. We'll win. Marcus grinned. That's what I was hoping you'd say. Let's do this. The HOA filed their lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court on February 15th. They claimed that I had breached my easement obligations, damaged HOA property through negligence, and violated community standards. They sought a court order compelling me to reconnect my propane tanks, plus damages of $25,000. Marcus filed our response 2 weeks later. We denied all of their claims, asserted multiple affirmative defenses including selective enforcement and unreasonable demands, and filed a counterclaim for harassment and abuse of authority. We sought our legal fees plus nominal damages. The case was assigned to Judge Margaret O'Connell, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for being tough on frivolous lawsuits. Our first hearing was scheduled for late March. In the meantime, life went on. The clubhouse eventually got its heating system repaired with new propane storage and pressure regulation equipment installed at a cost of $19,000, which the HOA had to pay out of the reserve fund. Karen sent out a special assessment notice to all homeowners, adding $50 to everyone's monthly HOA fees to rebuild the depleted reserves. This did not make her popular. I continued to get the occasional piece of hate mail or nasty comment when I saw neighbors around the community, but I also had plenty of people express their support. Frank started a petition to recall the HOA board, which got signatures from about a third of the homeowners. It wasn't enough to force a recall election, but it sent a clear message that not everyone was happy with Karen's leadership. The court hearing arrived on a sunny Tuesday morning. Marcus and I met at the courthouse, along with the HOA attorney, a sharp-looking woman in her 40s named Jennifer Mitchell. Karen was there too, dressed like she was attending a funeral and looking grimly determined. Judge O'Connell called the case and asked both sides to present their arguments. Jennifer went first, laying out the HOA's position that I had breached my obligations under the easement agreement and caused significant damage to community property through my reckless and vindictive actions. When she was done, the judge turned to Marcus. "Mr. Chen, what's your response?" Marcus stood and calmly walked through our position. He explained that the easement agreement said nothing about requiring my property to provide propane service to the HOA. He detailed the months of harassment and unreasonable demands I had endured, including the $20,000 special assessment that the HOA had threatened. He showed the judge copies of all the professional reports confirming that my tanks had been installed by the developer and were code compliant. "Your Honor, the HOA spent months demanding that Mr. Thompson remove his propane tanks," Marcus said. "They threatened him with fines, they assessed unreasonable charges, and they created a hostile environment. Now they are upset because he actually complied with their demands by disconnecting his tanks from their system. You can't threaten someone for months to get rid of something and then sue them when they actually do it." Judge O'Connell looked thoughtful. "Miss Mitchell, how do you respond to that?" It does seem rather contradictory for the HOA to demand removal of the tanks and then sue when they were disconnected. Jennifer stood again, but she looked less confident now. "Your Honor, the HOA never demanded that Mr. Thompson disconnect his tanks from the Clubhouse system. We simply asked him to remove them entirely or relocate them to a less visible location." "But the effect would be the same, wouldn't it?" the judge asked. "If he removed the tanks or relocated them, the clubhouse would lose the backup propane supply either way." "That's not the point, Your Honor. The point is that Mr. Thompson took deliberate action to damage HOA property." "Did he, though?" "From what I'm reading in these reports, he hired a licensed technician to modify utility connections on his own property in accordance with all applicable codes. That's not damaging property. That's exercising his property rights." The judge flipped through more papers on her desk, and I felt a surge of hope. She seemed to be seeing things our way. "Here's what bothers me about this case," Judge O'Connell said. "The HOA created this entire situation by making unreasonable demands of Mr. Thompson. The propane tanks were installed by the developer. They're code compliant. They were clearly visible when Mr. Thompson purchased the property, and the HOA apparently had no problem with them for years. Then suddenly, they're a violation that warrants $20,000 in fines. That strikes me as selective enforcement and harassment. Your Honor, the HOA has the authority to update and enforce community standards," Jennifer argued. "Within reason, yes. But not in a way that's arbitrary, capricious, or retaliatory. And from what I'm seeing here, that's exactly what happened. The HOA decided to go after Mr. Thompson. They ignored the fact that his tanks were actually supporting their own infrastructure. And when he finally defended himself by disconnecting his property from their system, they sued him. I'm not inclined to reward that behavior." Jennifer tried to mount another argument, but the judge cut her off. "I'm going to issue a ruling from the bench," Judge O'Connell said. "The HOA's claims are dismissed with prejudice." Mr. Thompson had every right to disconnect his propane tanks from the HOA's system, especially after months of threats and harassment. As for the counterclaim, I'm awarding Mr. Thompson his reasonable attorney's fees and costs. Both sides should submit their fee documentation within 30 days. I felt like I could float out of the courtroom. Marcus shook my hand, grinning broadly. Karen looked like she'd been slapped. Jennifer was already packing up her briefcase, her expression carefully neutral. Outside the courthouse, Marcus and I did a more thorough debrief. "That went even better than I expected," he said. "O'Connell saw right through their nonsense. You should get most of your legal fees back, which is pretty rare in HOA cases. How much do you think they'll end up paying?" "Based on my hours, probably somewhere between 10 and 15,000. I'll put together a detailed breakdown and submit it to the court." We parted ways, and I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months. The legal battle was over and I'd won, but the drama wasn't quite finished yet. 2 days after the court hearing, I was working in my home office when I heard sirens outside. I looked out the window to see police cars and an unmarked sedan pulling up in front of Karen's house across the street. I watched as 2 uniformed officers and a man in a suit walked up to her door. Karen answered, and even from a distance, I could see her face go pale. There was a brief conversation, and then the man in the suit gestured for her to step outside. Karen grabbed her purse and her keys, locked the door behind her, and got into the back of one of the police cars. She wasn't handcuffed, but she clearly wasn't going voluntarily either. I immediately called Frank to see if he knew what was happening. "Dude, did you see the cops at Karen's house?" he said before I could even ask. "Yeah, I'm watching from my window. What's going on?" "I don't know for sure, but I heard through my wife, who heard from Susan, who lives next to Gloria, that there's been some kind of investigation into the HOA finances. Gloria apparently went to the police with concerns about missing money." "Missing money?" "Yeah, like tens of thousands of dollars. Gloria's the treasurer, right? She's been noticing discrepancies in the books for months, but Karen kept shutting her down. After the judge ruled in your favor, I guess Gloria decided she'd had enough and went to the authorities." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Are you saying Karen was embezzling from the HOA?" "I don't know for sure, but that's what people are saying." Over the next few days, the full story came out. Gloria had indeed gone to the Scottsdale Police Department with evidence that significant sums of money had been disappearing from the HOA accounts over the past 2 years. She'd been tracking discrepancies and trying to get the board to authorize an independent audit, but Karen had blocked her at every turn. When Gloria finally presented her evidence to the police, they opened an investigation. What they found was even worse than Gloria had suspected. Karen had been systematically embezzling from the HOA for almost 3 years, using a variety of schemes. She'd set up fake vendor accounts and submitted invoices for work that was never performed. She'd approved consulting fees to companies that didn't exist. She'd even skimmed money from the special assessments that homeowners paid, pocketing the difference between what was collected and what was actually needed. In total, the police estimated that Karen had stolen somewhere between $80,000 and $100,000 from the HOA. The revelation sent shockwaves through our community. Emergency HOA meetings were called. Dennis and Todd both resigned from the board in embarrassment, claiming they'd had no idea what Karen was doing. Gloria stepped up as interim president and immediately authorized a full forensic audit. Karen was charged with multiple counts of theft, fraud, and embezzlement. She posted bail and was released pending trial, but she avoided all of her neighbors like the plague. Her husband, a mild-mannered accountant named Robert who apparently had no idea what his wife had been doing, filed for divorce within 2 weeks. The criminal case moved slowly through the system, but by late summer, Karen had agreed to a plea deal. She pled guilty to theft and fraud charges, agreed to make full restitution to the HOA, and was sentenced to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. The day she was sentenced, I happened to be at the courthouse for a completely unrelated client meeting. I saw her in the hallway with her attorney, looking small and defeated in her orange jumpsuit. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw something there that might have been regret or shame or just exhaustion. Then she was led away by the bailiffs, and that was the last time I ever saw Karen Whitmore. Life in Scottsdale Springs slowly returned to normal after that. Gloria organized new elections for the HOA board, and a slate of reasonable, level-headed homeowners were elected. One of their first acts was to formally apologize to me for the harassment I'd endured, and to confirm that my propane tanks were perfectly acceptable under community standards. They also asked, somewhat sheepishly, if I would consider reconnecting my tanks to the Clubhouse system. I thought about it for a while. Part of me wanted to tell them to pound sand after everything I'd been through. But the new board members were decent people who hadn't been part of Karen's reign of terror, and I did still have to live in this community. I'll do it on one condition, I told Gloria at a board meeting. The HOA pays for all costs associated with the reconnection, and I get a formal easement agreement that protects me from any future claims related to those tanks. They stay on my property, they stay visible, and no one ever threatens me about them again. Done, Gloria said immediately. I'll have our attorney draft the easement agreement this week. 2 weeks later, a propane technician reconnected my tanks to the Clubhouse system. The HOA paid the bill. I signed the new easement agreement, and that was finally, truly the end of it. Looking back on the whole ordeal now, more than a year later, I still can't quite believe everything that happened. What started as a petty HOA complaint about propane tanks escalated into legal battles, criminal investigations, and prison sentences. It was exhausting and stressful and expensive, even though I ultimately won and got my legal fees back. But it also taught me some important lessons. I learned that standing up to bullies is worth it, even when it's hard. I learned that sometimes the people who seem most concerned with rules and propriety are actually hiding their own misdeeds. And I learned that my neighbors, for the most part, are good people who were just as frustrated with Karen's tyranny as I was. These days, life in Scottsdale Springs is peaceful. The new HOA board is reasonable and responsive. The clubhouse is well maintained and properly heated, with my propane tanks once again providing backup support to the system. I still get the occasional compliment from neighbors who remember how I stood up to Karen and inadvertently exposed her crimes. And every time I walk past those 2 tan propane tanks sitting on their concrete pad beside my house, partially screened by decorative brickwork, I smile. They're still there, exactly where they've always been, exactly where they belong. Just a couple of ordinary propane tanks that somehow became the center of an extraordinary neighborhood drama. They're not going anywhere, and neither am I. My home is my castle, and those tanks are part of my fortress. Karen Whitmore learned that the hard way, and her story serves as a reminder to anyone who thinks they can abuse their authority without consequences. The Arizona sun beats down on my house just like it always has, and my generator stands ready to kick on if we lose power, fueled by those two controversial propane tanks. The pool heater works perfectly, keeping the water at a comfortable temperature for evening swims. The outdoor kitchen lets me grill year-round, enjoying the mild winters and finding shade in the brutal summers. Everything works exactly as it should, exactly as the developer intended when this house was built, exactly as it was when I bought the place and fell in love with it. And if there's one thing I've learned from this whole experience, it's that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to simply give people exactly what they're asking for. The HOA demanded that I deal with my propane tanks, so I did. I disconnected them from the Clubhouse system, which was my right as a property owner. The fact that this caused problems for the HOA wasn't my fault. It was the predictable consequence of their own unreasonable demands. Sometimes karma works in mysterious ways, and sometimes it works through propane lines and pressure regulation systems. I've stayed friendly with Gloria, who continues to serve as HOA president. She's done an excellent job rebuilding trust in the organization and implementing better financial controls to prevent future embezzlement. The forensic audit revealed the full extent of Karen's theft, and the HOA eventually recovered most of the stolen money through a combination of Karen's restitution payments and an insurance claim. Frank and his wife have become good friends of mine. We get together regularly for barbecues and pool parties, and we still laugh about the great propane tank wars of last year. Frank loves to tell the story to anyone who will listen, usually embellishing it significantly and making me out to be some kind of strategic genius who planned the whole thing from the beginning. The truth is much simpler. I was just a guy trying to defend his property rights against an unreasonable HOA board, and I got lucky that their own infrastructure dependencies gave me leverage. But I'll take the reputation as a tactical mastermind. It makes for a better story, and it keeps other potential HOA busybodies from targeting me. Marcus and I still keep in touch too. He sends me a Christmas card every year with a photo of a propane tank on the front, which never fails to make me laugh. He told me that the case has become one of his favorites to cite when dealing with other HOA disputes. The propane tank case, he calls it, and apparently it's helped several of his other clients stand firm against unreasonable HOA demands. As for Karen, I've heard through the grapevine that she's doing her time at the Women's Correctional Facility in Goodyear. Her ex-husband Robert still lives in the neighborhood, and by all accounts, he's a nice guy who was genuinely blindsided by his wife's criminal activities. He keeps to himself mostly, and I don't blame him for wanting to avoid the whole situation. The clubhouse continues to host community events, now properly heated by its upgraded propane system with backup support from my tanks. I attend occasionally, though I'll admit I get a certain satisfaction every time I walk past the propane equipment room and know that part of that system is connected to my property through lines that I can disconnect any time I choose. I never will, of course. The new easement agreement protects both me and the HOA, and there's no reason to cause problems now that reasonable people are in charge. But knowing I have that power, feels good. My business has thrived over the past year. Apparently, some of my neighbors spread the word about me being a graphic designer, and I've picked up several local clients. I've designed logos for 3 small businesses in Scottsdale, created branding packages for 2 local restaurants, and even did the graphics for a real estate agent's marketing materials. Word of mouth is powerful in these planned communities, and my reputation as someone who stands up for themselves apparently translates well to business credibility. I've also gotten more involved in the HOA now that it's run by reasonable people, I attend most of the monthly meetings, and I've even volunteered to serve on the architectural review committee. It feels good to have a voice in the community decisions, and I want to make sure that no other homeowner gets treated the way I was. Last month, we had an issue where the HOA tried to cite someone for having a satellite dish on their roof. I was the first person to speak up, reminding the board about federal regulations that protect homeowners' rights to receive satellite signals. The citation was immediately withdrawn, and the homeowner thanked me profusely afterward. It felt good to pay forward the support I'd received from people like Frank and Gloria during my own battle. The desert landscape around my house changes with the seasons, subtle shifts that most people don't notice. The ocotillo plants bloom brilliant red in the spring. The palo verde trees turn golden with tiny flowers. The saguaro cacti stand sentinel over the neighborhood, their arms raised to the sky like they're blessing our little community. And through it all, my 2 propane tanks sit quietly beside my house, doing their job, causing no problems, and reminding me every day that standing up for what's right is worth the fight. I never imagined when I bought this house that a couple of propane tanks would become such a significant part of my life story. But that's how life works sometimes. The smallest things can become the biggest battles, and the most ordinary objects can become symbols of much larger principles. Property rights matter. Standing up to bullies matters. Due process matters. And sometimes, giving people exactly what they ask for is the best revenge of all. The sun is setting now over Scottsdale, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that only the Arizona desert can produce. I'm sitting on my back patio, enjoying the cool evening air, listening to the gentle hum of my propane-powered pool heater, maintaining the perfect water temperature. Tomorrow I'll get up and start another day of work, another day of living in this community that I've fought so hard to defend my place in. And those propane tanks will still be there, right where they've always been, right where they belong. Sometimes the best stories are about ordinary people standing up to unreasonable authority. Sometimes the best endings are when justice actually prevails, and the bullies face consequences for their actions. And sometimes the best feeling in the world is knowing that you stood your ground, you did the right thing, and you won. My name is Xavier Thompson. I live in Scottsdale, Arizona, and I won a war over propane tanks. It's not the most glamorous achievement, but it's mine, and I'm proud of it. The HOA threatened me over those tanks. I removed them from their system. Their clubhouse heating failed. And in the end, they discovered that their president was a criminal who'd been stealing from them for years. Justice was served in ways I never could have predicted, and my little act of defiance became the catalyst for positive change in our community. Looking at those tanks now, gleaming slightly in the fading light, I can't help but smile. They're just metal containers holding liquefied petroleum gas, nothing special or remarkable in themselves. But they represent something important: the right to defend your property, the importance of standing firm against injustice, and the unpredictable ways that truth eventually comes to light. Karen Whitmore tried to bully me into submission, and instead, she ended up exposing herself as a thief and going to prison. The HOA tried to fine me into bankruptcy, and instead, they ended up paying my legal fees and icing me. They tried to force me to remove essential infrastructure, and instead, they learned a harsh lesson about the importance of understanding your own systems before making demands. And me, I just wanted to keep my propane tanks and live in peace. Mission accomplished. The story of the Great Saguaro Springs Propane Tank War is already becoming neighborhood legend. New residents hear about it from their neighbors. usually with embellishments and exaggerations that make me sound either heroic or villainous, depending on who's telling the story. I don't mind either version. The truth is somewhere in between, but the core lesson remains the same. Don't start fights you can't win, and don't underestimate the quiet guy with the propane tanks. As full darkness falls over the desert and the stars begin to emerge in the clear Arizona sky, I raise my glass of iced tea in a silent toast to those two propane tanks, to Marcus Chen and his excellent legal work, to Gloria Martinez and her integrity, to Frank Mitchell and his support, and to Karma for eventually catching up with Karen Whitmore. And I toast to myself for having the courage to stand firm when it would have been easier to give in, for fighting back when I was threatened, and for never, ever backing down from bullies. The propane tanks remain, the clubhouse is heated, justice was served, and life goes on in Saguaro Springs. It's not the ending I expected when this whole thing started, but it's the ending we all deserved. Sometimes life gives you propane tanks, and sometimes those propane tanks give you the leverage to expose corruption, defeat tyranny, and win your freedom. Who would have thought? Not me, that's for sure. But I'm grateful for every minute of this crazy journey, even the difficult parts, because it taught me that standing up for yourself matters, that justice can prevail, and that sometimes the smallest battles can have the biggest consequences. The propane tanks stand guard beside my house, silent sentinels in the desert night. And I sleep peacefully, knowing that they're there, knowing that I fought for them, and knowing that I won. That's my story. That's how HOA threatened me over propane tanks, how I removed them from their system, how their clubhouse heating failed, and how it all led to so much more than anyone could have predicted. It's a story about property rights and personal courage, about standing firm and seeking justice, about the unpredictable ways that truth emerges and karma works its magic. And it all started with two ordinary propane tanks in Scottsdale, Arizona, on a hot Tuesday morning in November, when a woman named Karen Whitmore decided to pick a fight she couldn't win.